Hello, everyone. I hope you're all having a great day. I want to put a disclaimer for who are all listening. This is a little bit of a longer video, and the last story is just a story, but it is based off of realistic events and feelings. The final story, which is the longest of them all, is also the most emotionally distressing. It may be difficult to listen to, considering the events and the nature of the story itself. If you decide to listen, do so with this in mind. I appreciate all the love and support, as always. This just happened last night, but it's been bugging me all day. We live on a small farm. It's about 42 acres. In a more rural area of western North Carolina. The land has belonged to my husband's family for close to a century. We just recently bought out his family and built our home on it. We've been living in a small town for several years before moving to the country, but we live off the road quite a distance, so when it's quiet at night, any and every sound wakes me up, and I have to investigate or send my husband to, as he is always armed. Since we've moved in there have been several strange things that have happened. Namely, I've seen glowing lights that look just like a firefly in our bedroom in the middle of the night. It lit up once and disappeared, and was never seen again. We've heard lots of bangs and sounds like walking, which is unusual as it's a brand new building completed in December of 2021. However, last night got both my husband and I scratching our heads. At around 9 p.m., both of our young children were in bed asleep, and we hear several light knocks on our front door. We aren't the most sociable, so people don't just show up, especially late at night. We both looked at the front door and then at each other with concern. He peeked out the front window before opening the door. I assumed maybe it was his mother who lives down the road needing something and knocking quietly at the door. He began hollering out in case someone was walking around the house thinking we weren't going to answer. We took a step on the porch and it set off our security camera, which sent an alert. That's when I realized if anyone had come up on the porch to knock, we had gotten an alert from that camera. We both sat there trying to come up with a plausible explanation with no luck, but we know what we heard. So the most recent encounter happened just yesterday evening, although it began back in fall of 2019. Whenever I am using my telescope, no matter if it's outside or from within the observatory, occasionally there will be a tall humanoid being watching me from the distance. I'll try to go over the details, as I want to know exactly what that being could be. The first encounter with it was in fall of 2019, as I was inside the observatory looking west. As I then looked down into the garden, there was what I then thought was a human standing underneath a hanging wine plant looking up at me. I told it to go away, as I thought it was a person who sneaked into my garden, but it did not respond, and basically just stood there, moving very little. I then turned around to do telescope stuff, and as I looked again a few minutes later, it was no longer standing there. Since then, that thing will occasionally watch me from different places. I've encountered it about 10 to maybe 15 times already. But seeing that it never really came directly to me, I am not scared when I see it. I just kind of started greeting it and minded my business until it went away. It has some favorite hangout spots where it will appear most of the time. That's what I have noticed so far, but more on that later. The human-shaped thing itself is about 2.5 to 2.7 meters tall. I compared its size to the wine plant it stood beneath when I saw it the first time, which is not higher than 2.8 meters. It's very skinny, but not skinny as in has absolutely just bones. The skin is dark, almost a perfect gray, varying in brightness about its body. I shined at it with a flashlight the second time I saw it to try to scare it away. Before that, I thought it was just plain black. The head is about normal human size, but I was not near enough to see eyes or mouth, although it appears to have two dark areas, maybe holes, where us humans would normally have eyes. Again, seen from only the flashlight. It has longer legs and arms than humans. Their length fits to its proportions. They are skinny as well, and it usually has them just hanging down when it watches me. I was never near enough to see if it had fingers, but it looks like it has. It also seems to have hair, which, interestingly, is very long and seems to touch the floor. Me shining a light at it did not seem to change anything in its behavior. It just stood there, doing its usual things. Since it just basically stands and watches me, I've grown to just acknowledging it and letting it watch me. It has never done anything that scares me so far. When I see it, it moves very little. Just occasional arm twitches. It never takes a step in any direction, however. It also never looks away from me. When I look at it for a long period of time, it's usually just gone, or it changed its place. And when I look away while taking out my phone or try to take a photo in an obvious way, it's usually just gone within the few seconds I look on my phone to activate the camera. The places are different from time to time, although it has some favorite spots from which it watches me. These are the wine plant I told you about, 2 trees in the field just right outside my garden, and next to a small hedge. From there, it looks up to the observatory window. When I'm outside, it likes to stand in the open field or next to some trees. I've tried taking photos with my phone, and if I find them, I'll upload them somewhere for you to see. Does anyone know what this being could be? Or have you had a similar experience? I'd also really like to know if you can think if it can get aggressive. And if you think it will become aggressive, what could I do against it? So, I had a crawler encounter last year on August 14th, and I've been researching ever since. The area where it happened has a lot of history, with many marked and unmarked ancient Sioux burial grounds. I listened to an episode of Monsters Among Us tonight, and a caller described their paranormal experiences from the 90s, and the exact same area where I had my crawler experience. He described a spirit that would tug on men's beards, hearing footsteps, hearing an unrecognizable language, the feeling of being watched, and strange blue lights near the burial mounds. A year before I saw the crawler, I saw 3 short shadow figures near a creek mouth by the river. Later that same year, I was fishing by myself, and noticed a male in the woods about 40 feet behind me, wearing a white t-shirt with the hood up. The hood covered his eyes, but I could see the rest of his face. He stood there in the same spot for over an hour. I moved over to the same creek mouth I mentioned. When I looked up the creek, there he was again, watching me. I'm not saying this particular experience was paranormal, but it was creepy nonetheless. One of my friends also goes to this place quite frequently and said he saw a 70s muscle car drive on the frontage road near a secondary entrance to this place. He said the car vanished into thin air. One of his friends said he saw the ghost of a woman that appeared to him and suddenly backed away. Many times before I had the crawler sighting, I had the feeling that I was being watched, so much so that I would turn around abruptly, expecting to see somebody, but there was no one there. Many of my friends reported feeling the same way. I've come across a handful of crawler encounters that happened in graveyards, rumored to be haunted. So now, I'm wondering if there are other people out there that have had crawler sightings in areas with other paranormal activity. I'm interested to hear it. I was at a friend's house. It was 3 a.m. when we both heard 3 loud, violent knocks at the back door. These knocks reminded me of the time the feds kicked my door in, or when SWAT uses that tool to bust the door down. That was the aggression behind these knocks. We both went to the back door, and I looked out the window in the door. I couldn't see no one or anything there. We were confused. Thought it couldn't have come out of any animal. It's summer day, and there was no wind. There was no one on the back porch. Heat is off. Definitely wasn't the sound of clicking pipes. I didn't even ponder the possibility that it could be paranormal. So we both go back into the room, like what the heck was that? So I looked out the window in the room into the backyard to see if I had seen anything, and I see what looks like a person in the neighbor's yard, but it was a bit far out in the dark to be sure. So I picked up my iPhone and used the camera to be my eyes and zoomed in and thought I saw what looked like the form of a man or something with a top hat on. I made my friend turn off all the lights on our room and the TV so I could see out the window better this time. I saw it clear as day, and the feeling that came over my body was so negative. I don't know. I get the chills when I hear good music. But no, this was like every hair on my body stood up. And I had these chills coursing through my body, and I felt like, not terror, but like something was dreadfully bad. And I just prayed this was gonna go away. Yesterday, my friend hasn't seen anything, and I haven't at my home now. Mind you, I will upload pictures from my other phone, and yes, there was a light pole in the picture. I can't mistake as part of the shadow figure, but the next morning I figured it was still there, but the dark shadow itself was gone. I will always question what I see, but I know what I heard, and I can't deny what I felt. Mind you, I'm not religious, but I am spiritual, and I do believe in a higher power, and I was indifferent about ghosts and spirits, but it was creepy, especially after I researched for a few and found others describing the same thing I saw. This was a day ago, and I'm just wondering if anyone has any input. A saucer was seen flying over the area, and at about noon, a 56-year-old mechanic named Jose Camillo a man of some education and of excellent reputation, ran into two entities that may have belonged to its crew. Passing along a road through a belt of scrubland containing many banana trees, he suddenly rounded a bend and beheld two young people sitting on the stump of a fallen banana tree. This in itself at once struck him as odd, for even small children know better than to sit on such things, as they leave ineradicable stains on clothing. But when the two people jumped onto their feet, he saw what they were, only 80, 90 centimeters in height, and certainly not normal folk. Their complexions were brown, and their faces shriveled, and fewered like those of old people. Their hair was white, their heads rather large in proportion to their bodies and very round, and their eyes were slits like those Asian descent, but he thought proportionately larger than those of human beings. One of the little men had a sparse beard and wore a dark, peaked cap. The other was bareheaded. Both appeared to have white hands. One was carrying under his arm a rod-shaped object about 50 centimeters long and about as thick as a flashlight. When the being carrying the rod saw the witness, it jumped up and looked so astonished that it seemed his eyes would leap from the sockets themselves, and he made a gesture with the other hand towards this apparatus under his arm as though thinking of using it against him. The other little man, who seemed much less alarmed, wore a blue shirt-like garment, olive green trousers, and shoes which looked like tennis shoes. The material of his clothing looked tropical and shiny, but the most remarkable feature was his luminous belt. This covered the upper part of his chest, from shoulder to shoulder, and from it there flashed out vivid lights. Bluish, red, yellow, and green, like the flashes from an electric wielding kit, so bright that you could not look at it. Between the entities stood a cylinder about 1 meter, 20 centimeters in height, and 15 centimeters in diameter. The man with the luminous belt, who was closer, now jumped to his feet also, and grabbed the cylinder by a handle in the middle of it, and began running off, staggering as he did so, and he collided with his companion, so that they both nearly fell to the ground. The witness, meanwhile, had also taken to his heels, but looked back in time to see them vanish among the trees. I should start off by saying I'm very spiritual. So I believe in entities, energies, demons, angels, whatever you can really think of. And because of this, I think it's safe to say I've had my fair share of paranormal experiences. Some casual, some frightening, but nothing as fucking terrifying as this. I think it's important to know that my town is right next to a reserve, as well as lots and lots of wooded areas and abandoned property. And it's not uncommon that people have claimed to have seen skinwalkers. It's not too terribly uncommon to hear things like laughing coming from the woods, or see coyotes or deer either looking odd or walking on their hind legs. I guess I should probably actually explain what's been going on now. A few days ago, me and my friend were walking back to my house, and the trail we were taking was a gravel road that led down a winding downward hill, surrounded by trees, the old abandoned property. And as we were walking, I noticed something odd, something I'd never seen before. It was what looked like to be an old barn that was abandoned. This intrigued me and my friend, as to us, this looked to be perfect. A perfect spot to smoke, drink, and etc. and immediately decided to make plans to do so there within the bare future. Fast forward 2 days. Me and my friend are hanging out at my house, and we decide we're going to steal some of my mom's vodka and go explore this old barn. Excited. The two of us start to get ready to go, and just as I'm packing a small bag of essentials to take with us, I notice something is wrong. Like, really wrong. I don't really know how to describe it, other than as the worst I've ever felt. There was just this plunging, sickening, awful feeling that wafted over my whole body, causing my anxiety to rise. I turned to my friend and asked if he felt it too. He said he did, and we quickly decided to grab some incense and cleanse a little before we left. I did so, and for a second I felt relief wash over me as the feeling went away, only for it to come rushing back a second later. Not even a minute later, me and my friend are trying to find other ways to cleanse when suddenly we hear noises, movement coming from outside my window, like movement and some wheezing. Panicked, my friend tells me to shut the window. I rush over and quickly shut it. I also go to lock it, but suddenly my lock won't shut. I've never had issues locking it before this point, but suddenly it was extremely hard to use. After a few seconds of frantic panic, I managed to lock it. We then backed up from the window and just sat on my floor trying to figure out what we were going to do. We obviously decided we are not going to that barn tonight. As we're sitting on the floor making protection sigils and spell jars, I remember that feeling only seemed to have happened when we spoke about the barn. I told my friend about this and decided there's something out there that definitely doesn't want us near that barn. We probably spent another hour cleansing my room. The feeling was still there, as was the odd knocking or muffled noise from outside. We tried everything: sage, incense, sigil, protection spells, herbs, crystals, music, and affirmations. Only after an hour of doing all of those did the feeling start to cease. I'd like to say that this whole thing is over and I've moved on, but unfortunately, that is not the case. Last night, I asked my younger brother if he could keep his window shut for the next few nights. I didn't want to tell him why, as I didn't want him to be scared, but the next few words out of his mouth scared the fuck out of me. He then told me that he was planning to, as just that night after I had fallen asleep, he was still awake and could hear wheezing and shuffling coming from outside his window. He then told me after he heard the noises, he got up and went and stood in the hallway and noticed that my window had been flung open, and that those noises were then coming from my bedroom, and they were now louder. That was last night, and he told me this. So, naturally, I spent about 20 minutes cleansing the fuck out of my room, and as I was doing that last night, I also decided to make some protection runes. So I made one, drew it on a piece of paper, and stuck it to my window. I was talking to my friend on the phone while doing so, and I started to explain the whole barn story when suddenly the feeling came rushing back and the protection sigil paper went flying out of my window. I know how this sounds. I know I sound like a paranoid teenager who just scared herself, and I know a feeling isn't really something to be afraid of, but there's something really fucking wrong. Whenever I'm by myself in this house, the feeling comes back, and I feel like I'm being watched. Whenever I start to cleanse, there's always this strong energy pulling me to stop. I don't know what to do. Now, for the reason I made this. Like in a goddamn horror movie, my mom's gonna be out of town for the next 3 days, leaving me and my brother home alone by ourselves for that time. My mom leaves tonight. And after she leaves, I'll be thoroughly cleansing my whole goddamn house. Depending if anything ever happens, I'll be updating. I live in Pennsylvania, and my friend and I went to a nature preserve at around midnight because it's fun to be creeped out. The woods we were in goes on for 5 miles, and we made it about 6 minutes into the woods when we came to the first fork in the road. Now, this isn't our first time in these woods at late hours, and whenever I am in there, I do get a bit paranoid. My mind starts to play tricks on me, like seeing things at the corner of my eye and stuff like that. But this time, I saw it. In front of all of us, I saw what was a red reflective eyes, and I thought it was my mind messing with me, so I wasn't going to say anything to my friend, but then he said to me, "Hey, do you see that?" And I cut him off, telling him I did see it. And there was an immediate, "oh shit" moment. We stood there thinking of what we should do as its eyes reflected off the lantern we brought. We saw it slightly moving, confirming that it was very much alive, and it was a creature, not a sign or something. We tried to back up a bit, and then it turned its head, so we couldn't see where it was anymore. So we did a very quick jog back towards the exit of the park, and about 3 minutes later, my friend stops me and is staring at a tree behind us. I take a look at it, and it looked around 6 or 7 feet tall. It was on its hind legs, had an arm wrapped around the tree, and was peeking over at us with a human-like head, but we couldn't make out any facial features. A branch broke, and we ran further up to where we were almost out. Next to me, the bush rustles. I scream, and we do a full-on sprint back to the car, and we get the fuck out of there. If this is something that sounds familiar, this is not the first time I'm seeing shadow people, nor is it my first paranormal rodeo. It is the first time in my 5 years of living in this flat that shadow people have surfaced. For the past few weeks, I've seen shadow people out of the corner of my eye. It's always a shadowy, human-like figure, but it is as if the body has no substance. I've never seen these apparitions in my current home before. Recently, things have become strained between the landlord and me, and I'm convinced that these apparitions are the manifestations of his ill intent. He wants us out, but he's too coward to boot my partner and me outright. The appearance of these figures is also coupled with a change in the landlord's behavior. Where he used to be open and inviting, he became greedy and mean-spirited. I also seem to notice shadow people a day or two before I receive an email from the landlord. I'm not quite sure what to make of this, but I'm convinced that shadow people I'm seeing now are a manifestation of some kind. I'm curious if anyone else has had an experience like this. Goblins, I've noticed, are black and glossy in color. The only one I saw had glowing orange eyes. It slightly resembled the goblin from the Tom Cruise movie Legend. It is said goblins are either a type of fae or some other interdimensional being. They can possess people, but in my experience, pretending like the afflicted person isn't afflicted causes the entity to lose interest. Call the person by their name and talk to them as you normally would while remaining calm, as if nothing is out of the ordinary. Ignore the entity and what they say and do entirely, and they will become bored and leave. I only saw the damn thing because I was doing some health care for an elderly gal who rarely slept. So I was severely sleep deprived. I was sleeping in the staff bedroom with the door cracked when I could have sworn I heard someone yell, "Wake up." My eyes popped open, and I saw what looked like to be a 5-foot tall, pitch black creature tiptoeing past my door in the hallway. Its glowing orange eyes were more shocking than its physical appearance for some reason. I waited for it to be out of my line of sight before getting up and checking on the lady I was working with. When I went into her room, she was still, seemingly asleep. I kneeled down beside her bed to plug in her two-way walkie-talkie in case she needed me, and she turned her face to me, looking at me, and her eyes were white, and she was speaking in a low, guttural voice in some unrecognizable language. I ignored it as if it was an attention-seeking behavior, and instead said her name and, "Oh hey, just making sure your walkie-talkie was plugged in, just in case you needed me." She turned away towards the wall, body slightly contorted, then relaxed, snorted as a person coming out of a deep sleep would. She turned back towards me, eyes no longer white, but now sleepy and adjusting to being awake. She sleepily asked, "What are you doing in my room?" I repeated what I previously said about the walkie-talkie and assisted her with a few things, and she was right back to sleep, curled up under a fuzzy blanket. As for me, I stayed up playing mobile games in the staff room with my light on. No way in hell I was sleeping after that. The first time I saw it, I was at the Children's Hospital in downtown San Antonio. My wife and I were there with our 3-year-old. He had developed a rare neurological disorder. It wasn't our first time at the hospital, and it wouldn't be our last. But that day was different. Early that morning, we woke up to Jonathan crying as we usually did. It was so terrible of a noise. I wish I couldn't hear it. The doctor said the disorder was beginning to cause him chronic pain. It made sleep difficult and left him lethargic throughout the day, walking and becoming more difficult for him. I've always thought that part of his condition was especially cruel since he just learned how. Maria and I went to a specialty coffee shop near the hospital to split a latte and get Jonathan something sweet. Raindrops streaked across the large window panes, obscuring the view of the place that brought so much pain to our little family. The foreboding towers of the hospital loomed beyond, the shapes going from left to right outside on the sidewalk. Their exact features were lost in the frosted lower portion of the glass that we sat next to. It was Fiesta in San Antonio. The celebration commemorated the Alamo and the Battle of San Jacinto. The streets were full of people, full of happiness. That hospital campus could have flooded with happiness for us. Just one visit had the doctors said what we needed them to say. But those words never came. Jonathan looked up from his iPad. We swore we'd never be those parents, but it just made things easier. He wasn't quite used to our arguing yet. That would come later. "What do you want me to do? A TA stipend isn't enough to afford these treatments, and a master's in history isn't going to get me a better job. We could barely afford the damn walker, last month's prescriptions." My voice was softer, but the tone was harsher. "Your time with us is more important than money." She was right, but I needed my PhD to get us the life we deserved, the life Jonathan deserved. I hated the way I spoke to her sometimes, The financial issues and Jonathan's health issues were oppressive. I was trying so hard to be a good father, but at times I forgot to be a good husband. One of the figures passing by stopped in the window. I'm doing everything I can to get us through this. I have to take more shifts at the bar. It's not negotiable. But you're right about the bus. I won't sell the car. Silhouettes of hands appeared on either side of the dark shape of the window. The hands were blurry through the frosted glass. Jonathan looked towards the figure. What the hell? Maria asked with a laugh. The hand slammed on the glass and her smile disappeared. Downtown was full of forgotten people that were wandering through the crowds of college kids and tourists. I grabbed Jonathan's jacket and put it on him. His wincing let me know that he was achier today. My little man was starting to become much too strong for a boy his age. He began to suffer in silence. The pain robbed him of his childhood, and his personality became more somber from day to day. He lost his happiness right in front of us. Disease took my baby, long before what I could see in the hospital did. It's extremely difficult to watch your child feel pain. Part of it is natural. Kids are going to feel pain. Teeth start to break through the little gums and tables seemingly appear right in front of them, whether you're watching or not. Knees get scraped and heads get bumped. And Jonathan would get a cold or start to teeth. It could be nice, as odd as that would say. When they turn one, they run all over, get into things they shouldn't, and put everything in their mouths. It's exhausting. But when he didn't feel good and would just lay his head on my chest and we'd watch Pokemon or Paw Patrol or whatever, it was so special. It hurt to watch him hurt, but it was just so special to have him be so close to me. But there is something horrible watching them go through something so unnatural. And those feelings of enjoyment I got from him cuddling up with me while in pain, however small and momentary, make me feel so goddamn sick to my stomach now. Did I do this to him? Did the small releasing in his discomfort and suffering manifest this current hell? Would I go to hell? Of course, I told myself it couldn't be my fault. None of that could be real. There's no such thing as manifestation, as karma, as hell. I didn't believe in the supernatural. Jonathan played with a toy truck on the other side of a pane of glass, separating him from the heartbreak his parents were experiencing. His mother put her hand on her mouth. Her unmanicured, bitten fingernails clawed at her cheek, then were hit by a stream of tears. She couldn't hold back the dam that should have broken a long time before. A nurse kneeled beside Jonathan and pointed at his truck. She smiled at him warmly. Her fingernails were pretty. They must have just been done. The red shimmered brightly in the fluorescent light. I thought about how her life must have been, how she had the time and money to get her nails done, and how, in my mind, that meant she probably never suffered and never would suffer loss. Of course, that wasn't true. The doctor reached for Maria and hesitated. He dropped the hand on top of his clipboard he held in front of him, grabbing the pin that rested on it. Both of his arms and fell to his side. He was defeated. Here was a man who must have suffered loss innumerably, at least by proxy. He gave me a knowing look and touched my shoulder. Then he turned and walked away. How could they do a job like this? Is it different when the ones being lost aren't theirs? I watched the love of my life sob uncontrollably as she realized she would lose love of hers. I don't think I had fully realized it yet. I took a step towards the glass to look at the most important part of my life. The nurse's back was to us slightly, obscuring Jonathan from view. I could see one of her hands on his right arm. She was gripping it violently. Her nails were digging into his skin. They were different now. The bright red polish was now a sickeningly pale gray. The cuticles were black and her fingers were stained with something. I could see blood from where she gripped my son so tight. She started to shake him violently. Her black, greasy hair shook back and forth. I slammed on the glass. I saw Jonathan's face. He was crying. He was in so much pain. It was a face I'd been seeing for months now. I banged on the glass repeatedly. As I ran for the door, the handle was locked. I shook it with all the force I could muster with the right hand and beat on the glass with my left. The woman's head turned. I said that I didn't believe in the supernatural, but I do now. I have to because of what I saw next. I'd never known fear like that, even with all I'd went through up until then. Not even the fear of losing my child latched upon my psyche like the entity in the hospital. I believe in hell because I saw a demon. The doctor ran towards me. I looked at him in shock. The face contorted by wickedness seared in my brain, the physical manifestation of evil, agony, torture, suffering, hell itself, staring into my soul. It had my child in its grip. I turned back, and the surprised blonde woman with clean, freshly painted nails stood back from Jonathan's bed. She looked scared and confused because the father of the boy she was trying to comfort was yelling at the top of his lungs at her and banging on the window. There was nothing there, just the nurse and my boy. Jonathan looked at me, not knowing what to think. The doctor tried to reassure me once more. Maria looked at me in disbelief, her face still wet with tears. I tried and failed to reassure Maria. The momentary but violent lapse at the hospital that afternoon added confusion and fear to a overflowing cocktail of emotions. The bar was flooding and we were drowning. How do you say goodbye to someone you've just met? Like, really, say goodbye. 3 years and a handful of months isn't enough time. How does one say goodbye when you've just begun to say hello? He only just learned to say hello, and not that long ago. As I paced around the small nursery we decorated a few years before, I looked my Jonathan in his face and thought about how a benevolent God could do this to him. He was good about going to sleep on his own, but I wanted to rock him to sleep every chance I got for the time left. Between my blasphemous thoughts and fond memories of fatherhood, I asked myself what I saw. My mind was racing. Every time I convinced myself it was nothing, I spiraled back down a supernatural rabbit hole full of phantasms and devils. It had to be. My conspiritual anxiety momentarily beat my rational inner voice. It was a demon. A demon was trying to take my son. My reasonable self fought back against my inner Alex Jones. You were stressed. You panicked. You need sleep. I laid Jonathan down and looked at his sweet face. My world. Tiny stars and moons danced on his body as the night's light shapes crossed his little race car bed on their revolutions around his room. They went round and round the tiny second bedroom of a 2-bed, 1-bath we couldn't afford like it was a solar system. But even though the room barely fit a toddler bed, an IKEA dresser, and a toy chest, it might as well have been an entire galaxy. because that little room was my whole universe. I woke up to nails on glass. Maria mumbled something. A horrifying shriek came from the monitor. There was movement on the screen. Jonathan's room. A figure draped in torn rags leaned over the race car like an old crone. The black matted hair glistened as it swayed back and forth over the little boy in Paw Patrol pajamas. The crusted claws from the hospital grasped them and began to pierce the fabric as the intruder gripped my son. I bolted out of the bed and fell to the ground after tripping on my slightly ajar laptop. I rushed to my feet and to the door. I attempted to rip it off its hinges and make it to my world. It was not going to take him from me. I busted through the door to Jonathan's room and he woke up startled. The window was open. Scratches were all over the glass and the wood frame. We lived in an interior of the complex in the corner, so the rest of the building was visible to us across the courtyard. The grotesque and twisted body of what looked like a woman clung to the courtyard wall perpendicular from Jonathan's window. Its claws gripped the stone facade, and black liquid crept from under the points where the claws broke the material. Its legs snapped and groaned as it crawled backwards, contorting up and all over the building. Its glaring gaze locked on to us the entire time. I will never forget the smile it bore. The intrusion into our lives had been violent and visceral, like Jonathan's diagnosis. The entity floored us. An already shaky foundation began to slip from under the crumbling structure of our lives, while the sickness was an erosion of the pillars of our lives. The decrepit demon was an uncontrollable demolition of our family. Maria didn't believe me about the hospital or the courtyard, which made the persistent glimpses of the woman impossible to mention. This dug a deeper divide between us. Our marriage was crumbling. It was like the woman came into our lives to blow everything up, and then slithered into the darkness to watch our lives implode. Do you ever get the feeling that something is watching you, like a heavy pressure on your awareness, but when you look, there's nothing there? That's all that came after that night in Jonathan's room for some time. She lurked just outside my awareness and stalked her prey, my son. There eventually came the small moments where I'd see her. A woman standing in line in the grocery store in front of us, with the hair of a rotting corpse whose head would always be cocked in just a way so that I couldn't see the face. A gray hand wrapped just around distant playground equipment, hooves extending below a dress at church, hair dangling out of an air conditioner vent, eyes in the black of night, a stench, a pressure, a feeling, fear. I never quite saw her, but she was there, watching, waiting. Eventually, Maria would not believe me, but she finally saw her the way I had. One day, she took Jonathan to the river. It could have been one of his last times as far as she could have known. It was a sweltering hot San Antonio day. The oppressive heat beats down on the Alamos City's residents unlike many other places. It made things uncomfortable for Jonathan, so getting out of the house could be hard. He was mostly confined to his chair at that point. The heat made his chair get unbearably hot, and the fabric made him sweat even more. Maria thought that nature could be good for him though, so she took him. I had to work. They parked just off the road near the bridge and hiked down to the riverbank with Jonathan on Maria's back. She had let him sit on the bank of the river in the shallow water. He couldn't move well, but if he did, he was a smart enough boy to know not to go much deeper. She told me she had only turned her back for a moment. The part of the river they went to was mostly covered in shade, a dark, lonely section of the river free from tourists and college kids. with cans of Lone Star and UT and Texas State koozies, free from loud Texas country and the screams and happiness of kids who lived full lives despite the shade. Maria still wanted to put sunscreen on Jonathan for the little bit of time when he was in the sun. When she started walking back with it, she lifted her head and he was gone. On the far side of the river, the water splashed violently. The demon's arms and black hair were submerged in the water, which flew up all around it. Small hands reached up and small feet kicked violently. Maria jumped in and grabbed as much water as she could to propel herself and kicked as hard as she could to get to the other side. She was never a great swimmer. The current in the middle of the wide part of the river was much stronger. She gave everything to get our son. Maria began to take in water. Sputtering and gasping, she called out for our son. The water got in her face and obscured her view on the scene. She realized in that moment, while thinking every other possible thought imaginable while also worrying about her son, like a mother's brain does, that this was the thing I had been talking about. She was watching her child die. She was watching the demon kill him. But the unexpected happened. Surely, the intention was to take him. Take his life. Take his soul. But she watched the woman drag Jonathan out of the water, onto the bank by his leg. He screamed, of course, and fought as hard as his weak body would allow. But in that moment, it didn't seem like the intention was to kill him. Maria watched our son being dragged through the mud, rocks, and 6 of the Guadalupe River bank and into the dense woods, kicking and screaming, crying out for his mom. The disfigured woman turned as if it delved into the Texas Hill Country. She told me that she'd never forget its smile. The woman had been sighted for more than 100 years, unbeknownst to us at the time. She and her husband were farmers, far outside of San Antonio near that quiet, shady bend of the river. They had 2 kids and a happy life in South Texas. They probably played in Elm Creek and swung off ropes into the river. Goats grazed and chickens ran around pecking at bugs. The dogs chased sticks from the Mexican white oaks that shaded the serene property. But one clear night, with all the stars of the universe seemingly visible in the Texas sky, a stranger came. He yelled as he banged on the door and hurled slurs at the family. He had a problem with the Mexican wife and their interracial children. He somehow had a problem with the marriage of 2 cultures in the borderland where he himself was the true outsider. His breath reeked of alcohol and his beliefs of ignorance and bigotry. He brandished a knife and almost tripped on it as he made his way to one of the goats. The wife covered the children's eyes with each hand as he tore into their livestock. He slashed at the goats as it bleated into the cool night air. Blue bonnets blew in the wind before the bloody carcass collapsed on top of them. The man was covered in blood. They tried to ignore him, and eventually he stumbled off into the night. Early in the morning before the sun rose, the husband smelled smoke. He woke his wife and children. The fire had already engulfed much of the ground floor, but they were able to make it to the front door. It was blocked. Even if the back door hadn't been blocked as well, it was rendered useless by the flames that guarded it. As the family rushed back up to the top floor, the stairs gave way beneath them. The husband and daughter fell into the fire below. The woman reached for them, but could barely touch the fingertips of the husband, who was now burning alive. She had to take her son and get out. She fought with all her might to get a window open as the screams of her family rang out amidst the roar of the fire. The window was stuck, and so were they. She held her son tightly as the house began to fall apart and the fire overtook them. She covered him as best as she could, but the fire was unstoppable. The woman awoke in the smoldering rubble of her once beautiful home. In her burnt, blistering limbs, her son was cradled in death. The fire melted her feet into solid, calcified masses that resembled hooves. Her hands were barely protected by her crossed arms. Patches of her hair burnt away, completely with just a few wisps left here and there. Her face was completely disfigured and her body mutilated, but the physical pain of her injuries were nothing compared to the emotional trauma. Eventually, people from town came to the scene to find the charred remains of the family, but the woman was nowhere to be found. All that was left was a trail of ash, blood, and flesh that led to the river. Her body was never found. I saw her again not too long ago. It was when I was on the top stack of the library on campus. I was researching her. I don't forgive her, and don't in any way think she is good or seek to justify what she did to my son, but I empathize with her. Her story is tragic. She wasn't always a monster, but I now know that there are two kinds of monsters in this world. Actual monsters, the urban legends like the Donkey Lady, and human monsters. Those monsters whose hatred and ignorance stoke tragedy. The flames of tragedy in which monsters are made, whether they be humans or something else. I saw the lady standing at the far end of the bookshelves near biographies. All of those books paled in comparison to the story of her life and what came after. She stood hunched over, disfigured in anguish, holding the hand of my son, Jonathan. He stood straight. He looked fuller in the face. He was healthy. He smiled and gave a little wave. I will never forget that smile. Part of me dies each time I think of that moment. Not because I miss him, which is also true, but because he seemed happier. He seemed better off without me. Were we bad parents? I was a bad father, unworthy of his love and the life he's seen with us. Was he in a better place with the lady? The demon? The mother who just wanted her kids back? The mother who endured fire and racism to protect her children? This became all I could think of as I read and read to find out what happened to my son. I watched her walk back into the darkness of the dark stacks, letting go of my son's hand. Then he turned and went with her. I will never forget the look on his face. I was a bad father because I thought that he was better off without me, when the reality was that he deserved to be with his family. He deserved to be with the mother who brought him into this world and loved him every fiber of her being. Parents are meant to do everything for their children, to protect them from bigotry, from fire, from nature, from sickness, from death as best as they can. I am a good father. The lady protected her son up until the very last breath. I am going to do the same. I am going to get him back. Thank you everyone for listening. If your story was told, I'm glad I'm the one who could tell it. I appreciate all the love and support. I hope you enjoyed today's stories as much as I did reading them.